let's go 2 before H, please. Could we just have bassoon, side drum, piano, trumpet from where you come in with this figure?
A wild idea came to me, to make a piece that no conductor could conduct.
And you just play with literally with what you hear?
The music, in its playing as well as its substance, should have some freedom in action and thought, as of an explorer. These notes, marks, and near pictures of sound, etc., are, in a kind of way, a platform for the player to make his own speeches on.
But you mustn't watch. If you try to watch me, you'll be totally lost.
I've then got 2 bars rest, and then
You're in 2-2, right? From the moment they begin, they have chink, chink, chink.
I did what
chink,
I wanted
chink.
to, quite sure that the thing would never be played, and perhaps could never be played.
Right. Do it once without me. Just play it as you have it. Chink. Just think about it without making a noise, would you? Letter T.
The words and the music we just heard are by Charles Ives. The orchestra was rehearsing the central section of Putnam's Camp, which is the second of his 3 places in New England. They were not playing incompetently, just in case we gave that impression. It was an attempt to come to grips with the imprecision that Ives actually programmed into his scores. In one sense, all his music is a sketch, free-flowing streams of ideas, sometimes individual, sometimes in combination. He was constantly adding to it. He urged players to elaborate it as they wished. He even refused to copyright it. He was trying to reawaken the untrained performing techniques and attitudes that he so admired in his father's band and in all popular musical culture. These qualities he considered to be the essence of great music making, a natural counterpart of what he was trying to do in his music, which was, he said, to reflect the sense of many people living, working, and occasionally going through the same deep experience together. Music that would give the ever-changing, multitudinous feeling of life that one senses in the city. And Ives was, at least during his creative life, a man of the city. He was born in 1874 and brought up in small-town New England, but he went on to receive the best possible musical education at Yale and settled in New York City, where with a partner he became a millionaire insurance executive. The bulk of his music was composed during the first 15 years or so of this century in New York City, mostly in the evenings and nights after work, and in an ever-increasing frenzy, which finally brought on some form of breakdown from which he never fully recovered, though he lived on until 1954. Ives consciously modelled himself on certain of the New England philosophers, in particular Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose spiritual ruggedness Ives admired. Ives said Emerson hacks his way up and down, as near as he can to the absolute. There was also Henry Thoreau, the nature mystic, whose views on music struck a sympathetic chord. Basically, Thoreau believed that the music was not in the notes. Ives echoes this when he describes one of his pieces as the sounds that clothe the music. His own father had chided him once for disparaging the singing of one of the local townsfolk. Don't pay too much attention to the sounds. If you do, you may miss the music. If it was difficult for a 19th century preacher like Emerson to think about the absolute, how much more difficult has it become in the 20th century? In 1985, the musical world celebrated the tercentenars of Bach and Handel. When we listen to their music, its musical time seems composed of such a meaningfully ordered, organic sequence of events as to suggest that the age that gave it birth was one in which the structure of experience had some universality. Their musical structures have a coherence from which we feel that we can readily extract some meaning, and that is the continuing universal power of such music. It seems to offer some ultimate guarantees. In this century, the structure of experience is not like that. That kind of sharing has given way to something more personal, more private, more individual. Works like the B minor Messiah will never be written again. But I still believe that music, like all art, continues to be about some ultimate truth. It represents, it refers to something other than itself. Artists in this century have been very self-conscious about this otherness. Self-conscious in that the moment you begin to make something as a work of art, the very consciousness of this act clashes with the spirituality you're trying to embody. Things like method, style, personality, the tools of the trade, tradition, they all get in the way. And in this programme, we're going to show how not one but two composers coped with this dilemma. Two composers who, on the surface, would appear to have very little to do with one another. For the moment, let's stick with Ives. I'll never forget an experience I had when I stayed in an old house. One day I discovered a room which turned out to be full of all sorts of old objects, musical instruments, old gramophone records. There was an old horned gramophone. Sheet music, Victorian sheet music of dances and parlour room ballads. It was an absolute treasure trove, a magic place. And I stood in the middle of all this rubbish, started rummaging through, in no order, with no particular purpose in mind. I was simply fascinated. And then, quite unexpectedly, I'd light on something which completely took my imagination, and I'd stand there enraptured. Ives' music works rather like that. It's fun and full of familiar things, a junk room of associations. Ives realised that people create their patterns of experience out of such associations, out of their memories. For Ives, for most people, he believed, their deepest intuitions had been most intensely felt in childhood. And what he had to do was somehow to bypass adult experience so as to be able to reach back to this state of childhood innocent awareness. Ives knew what the keys to his own memory were. They were the places of his childhood, places in New England, and all the musical events and objects associated with them. Revivalist hymns, spirituals, country dance tunes, band music, the cacophony of sounds heard during holiday festivities, all used freely, like, as he said, a boy on the 4th of July who wants to do anything he wants to do, and that's his one day to do it. Ives doesn't disobey musical rules. He was a highly trained musician. But he does loosen the corset of musical decorum. Anything goes. There's no aesthetic standard. And in that sense, he is a musical innocent. That's the opening of The Alcotts by Ives. The Alcotts, the New England family of Louisa M. Alcott, the author of Little Women. The piece is an evocation of the home of the March family, where Beth sits at the little old spinet piano, in Ives's words, playing at Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Ives believed, as we've seen, that in popular musical culture, universality was instinct. But he believed equally that traces of the absolute were inscribed in the great artworks of the past. The opening of Beethoven's Fifth was his special obsession, an oracle, as he described it, the soul of humanity knocking at the door of the divine mysteries, something that had particular associations for all people. It echoes through the third and last of the three places in New England, the Housatonic at Stockbridge. Ives tells us that it was suggested by a walk that he took by that river, listening to the distant singing from the church. What Ives had in mind was something that gives one a sense of that constant organic flow going on in all life. The movement takes the form of a veil of sound, increasingly agitated, surrounding a tune, an extraordinary tune, which carries a peculiar wealth of associations. As we were recording it, everybody involved said that they seemed to know it. Danny Boy, Luther's Hymn Ein Feste Burg, a blues and a spiritual were all suggested. Actually, the tune is, or at least it begins with, the opening of Beethoven 5 again, but with just one note repeated. It kind of sets you going with its vague familiarity. And in case you think that I'm stretching a point when you hear it, the end of the piece, which is the climax of the whole work, is literally the Beethoven 4 notes. But with a special harmonization that makes it something else. We're going to pick up the score shortly before the chaotic close of the preceding movement, Putnam's Camp.
The ending of that piece is not the last sound you hear, but the silence that succeeds it. A silence that is actually written into the score. Despite all Ives' breaking with musical constraints, he did worry about form. And yet, ironically, across the ocean in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a new definition of form was being proposed. This is the most profound meaning of form, to lead to a great moment of silence, to mould the directionless, precipitous, many-coloured stream of life as though its haste were only for the sake of such moments. A question with life all around it. A silence with a rustling, a noise, a music, a universal singing all around it. That is form. That was the Hungarian writer George Lukács writing in 1908, the very year Ives composed one of his most famous and beautiful works, The Unanswered Question. Lukács has summed up Ives' music perfectly. All Ives' music is an unanswered question, an urge towards some ultimate mystery, symbolized in music by silence. And Lukács has also taken us directly to our second composer, Anton Webern. Anton Webern was born in 1883 and grew up in the musical world of Vienna. His studies of Renaissance music earned him a university doctorate, and still a young man, he became one of the first composition pupils of the composer Arnold Schoenberg. His music is the product of an extraordinary purity and refinement. His entire output can be played in about 4 hours. His music achieved scant success in his lifetime. He was accidentally shot dead by an American soldier of the occupying forces of Austria just before the end of the Second World War. By an almighty effort of refinement, Webern has managed to produce a music almost out of earshot, a music that seems only just to have emerged out of silence and seems ready to sink back into it, taking us with it. In his 5 pieces for orchestra, Opus 10, the instructions he's written in the score to number 3 give us a clue. It starts with the instruction, scarcely audible, followed by the second instruction, dying away. Like Ives, Webern also believed that music was not in the notes. Both composers use silence as a route to the universal in music. Ives with a conflation of sounds that leads us to a visionary moment of silence. Webern with dots of colour on a white page of silence. Also like Ives, Webern's music is located in the places of memory. His letters refer to it endlessly. When I read letters from my mother, he says, I could die of longing for the places where all these things have occurred. And after the sale of his childhood family home, in my memory, it appears to me like a lost paradise. He paid a return visit with his father and wrote to Schoenberg, everything has such a strong impact on me. This is not mere looking back, but rather a glimpse of timelessness, a concern with origins. For Webern, the recapture of innocence in his music, the return to a lost paradise, was to be achieved by returning to origins, the origins of musical language itself. Any Viennese composer was by birthright heir to a great musical tradition. Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms.
And that's only piano music. The problem for Webern was that music was already so saturated with overuse that the musical language itself was no longer innocent. Any group of notes you assembled conjured up associations, and even when you created your own style, that too quickly developed a memorability of its own. Webern didn't want that. He wanted a music quite free of that kind of content. But notes were what he had to deal with, so how did he go about purging his music of associations? Each of the 5 pieces was, he admitted, a lyric piece, a simple melodic line, by definition a song of personal emotion, an elegy to the memory of his mother. His first reference to the pieces was in a letter to Schoenberg. I have written 2 orchestral pieces. They're very brief. Nothing lengthier occurs to me. So how does he stop them sounding like other pieces? How do they in no way refer to anything within or without themselves? The obvious way, of course, would be never to use the same note twice. And Webern made an extreme statement along those lines. He said, I had the feeling that when all 12 notes were used up, and 12 notes is all a composer ever has to play with, the piece was over. That is more or less what you've just heard in piece number 4. He also said he was writing lyric pieces. Well, Grieg wrote lyric pieces. He'd do it like this. Webern writes lyric pieces, the 5 pieces, opus 10. Here's the opening of the first. I've used the same melody notes, but when I was doing it à la Grieg, there was harmony, there was rhythm. There's no harmony in the Webern, and there's no rhythm that you can perceive at all, not even anything that approximates to a beat. I'm playing it on the piano. But Webern gives each successive note to a different instrument, or a different combination of instruments. Trumpet and harp, celesta, harp and flute, glockenspiel, so that you never hear the melody projected in a curve through the same instrument. That immediately fragments the melody by giving a different colour to each note. And he was particularly influenced in this by the work of Debussy, particularly the idea that every instrument was equal to every other instrument. Another technique is something which technically we call octave displacement. That means that successive notes are not in the same register, but much higher or much lower than their neighbours. So the Grieg was, the Webern is. But most important, perhaps, is the interweave of sound and silence. Listen to the silence between the notes. Which more or less eliminates any kind of relationship being set up between the isolated notes. The silence itself, as we heard in the 3rd piece, is coloured in the manner of those miraculous recessions of sound that you hear in Mahler symphonies, the sounds of nature, the sounds that Webern heard in his childhood alpine retreat, but completely abstracted. The instruments he uses are cowbells, mandolin, guitar, harmonium, celesta. But if Webern has stripped away the traditional reference points in music, how are we supposed to respond to this texture of sound and silence? And the key seems to lie in the way the music focuses our attention towards the silences. It carries our feelings with it to the edge of audibility, and here it is our own instincts and intuitions that impose structures on the music. We structure it ourselves, no differently from the way we quite instinctively structure the sounds we hear in a place like this. Reactions like, "I don't understand it," cannot play any part in the experience of this music. The music is made by our individual vision. And insofar as there is any truth in these works, we structure it ourselves.
programme started with the idea that the music is not in the notes. And in our search for where the music does lie, we found that the fundamental idea of both Ives and Webern was to turn us all, each and every one of us, into artists. They do that by displacing our accustomed way of hearing things. In their entirely different ways, they present us with unclassified data in an attempt to convey something unedited, something that demands our involvement in the articulation of our own experience. In Ives, a seething foreground of musical fragments, heavy with association, breaks through all idea of order, never allows us to come to rest on a familiar level, until a tiny visionary moment in the music seems to take us to some transcendent truth.
Webern achieves this by reduction, only revealing so much as is necessary, a texture of silence and fragmentary gestures, fraught with background, an individual vision that we create from our own instincts. Webern was quite right to call his pieces lyric pieces. The lyric is the personal, individual poetic statement. These are songs we sing for ourselves, lyric pieces for our century, a new kind of universality, a universal singing. Virginia Woolf says it perfectly. The whole world is a work of art. We are part of the work of art. Hamlet, or a Beethoven quartet, is the truth about this vast mass that we call the world. But there is no Shakespeare. There is no Beethoven. We are the words. We are the music. We are the thing itself.